Welcome back to the Trucking Risk and Insurance podcast. Today we are joined by Ron Greene from Overhaul to discuss how the current supply chain turmoil is reshaping the industry. From the impact of shifting tariffs to the double whammy of rising fuel costs, we're diving into why small carriers must prioritize resilience over pure cost cutting to survive. We'll also explore why chaos in the market is a green light for cargo thieves and what you can do to strengthen the security protocols right now. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Trucking Risk and Insurance podcast.
Hey, Ron, welcome to the show. Can you take a minute and introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Ron Greene. I work for a company called Overhaul. Overhaul is a logistics security program company. When you think of Overhaul, think technology, software that's used in control center environments for monitoring freight, real-time, embedding devices and connecting to trucks with different data sources and monitoring freight as it moves around the world. We have control centers around the world, and you really focus on theft mitigation, but we interact with the trucking and logistics industry every day. My background, I've also owned and operated an asset-based trucking company for many years, but I've been in the logistics / trucking / transportation space all my career.
Well, welcome to the show. And we're going to talk a little bit, one of our, I don't want to say favorite topics because it's really hurtful at the moment, but we are going to talk a little bit about tariffs.
Somebody else's favorite topic.
So how tariffs, they've been shifting stuff around quite a bit. How is it affecting trucking, and specifically, how is it affecting the theft business?
Well, I'll give you my layman's kind of view of the world. Being involved in logistics and own a trucking company, and also interact with logistics industry every day. Supply chain disruption from any source, wreaks havoc in the trucking industry. You think you have business lined up in a certain, providing capacity, then all of a sudden there's immediate shift. And as a small trucking owner or a large trucking owner, you're scrambling to figure out how to react, how to keep your trucks moving, how to keep them profitable, how to keep your drivers from sitting idle and waiting for loads. Any disruption just wreaks havoc down to the dispatch level. All of a sudden you have a customer, you think you're moving X number of loads over the next month for them. You have that planned out. You have drivers kind of assigned to those loads, and all of a sudden that changes, and you're scrambling to keep your business profitable. The margins in trucking are so thin. We've been in a freight recession for quite a while. We're starting to come out of it right now, we think, but it just the trucking industry is a daily battle to keep profitable, and especially for the small guys. They're in that the tariffs are just one more disruption that has impacted their life, and forcing them to be creative in how to keep their business alive, is what it boils down to. In the last several years, you see articles of trucking companies going out of business for a litany of reasons. Most likely they aren't able to maintain profitability in the market conditions. And this is just one more factor that has impacted the trucking industry in general. The trucking industry operates, what I would call almost a frictionless market. Rate changes are very quick to happen. One day to the next, a change in, whether it be capacity, whether it be just import coming out of the ports or exports, anything that shifts that is going to affect the trucking operation in general. I think
I was going to say, I was just reading an article this morning pertaining to supply and demand, and we are seeing an increase in not in demand, but due to supply, because just exactly what you said, Ron, we've got a number of motor carriers that are exiting the industry, finding it's tight and whatnot. And I think that's one thing that's got to help clients be better at what they're doing, because they're getting busier. So you can't drop the ball now. You've got to be more diligent as to what you're doing and what your environment is that you're working in, for fear of, not keeping with the flow. And then when it comes to security, making sure if you've got procedures and protocols in place, don't change them just because you're getting busier now. Now's the time to strengthen them even further.
Correct. And criminals, they, from a security standpoint, criminals thrive in chaotic environments. They thrive, and they look for openings, they look for weak spots, they look for something to make a mistake, or when knowingly or unknowingly, and then they'll have opportunities to steal freight. In addition, just to the trucking operations, the tariffs have, there's still a lot of moving parts there, but the tariffs did have potential increase in equipment costs, importing metals for manufacturing, or importing finished goods that are used in the trucking industry was also affected by the tariffs. So it's the supply chain in general. Think beyond just a truck going down the road. The global supply chain has been in turmoil for many years.
Right.
Big shippers, big importers, they're focused more on resilience now than absolute cost cutting. They need to have a resilient supply chain, which includes good partners, good logistics partners, good trucking partners, and there's a focus on that right now in the corporate America in relation to supply chain.
Well, and the other shoe that just kind of dropped on trucking is fuel.
Yes.
Fuel is going up, I want to say almost exponentially at the moment. So there's tariffs are causing havoc. I think immediately fuel is causing havoc. What do you think that does to load security, Ron?
Well, it does, one, carriers, if they're not managing their fuel costs proactively and, have fuel tables and all their contracts so they can adjust pricing real time, it's going to pinch them. And they're going to operate at their margins until they get their rates adjusted. A lot of the big shippers, if you will, who end up paying the bill for the transportation, they want to operate at 2025 rates. They're going to push hard. Hey, this was our rate in December 2025. Let's keep it going. And the trucker has to be able to say, I can't operate profitably at that rate. I need it. I need a fuel surcharge increase, or I need an adjustment to the rate to account for this increased cost. If you look at, trucking operations, they're, fuel and insurance and equipment are typically the biggest cost structures, along with, paying drivers. Those are the top four. And when they're out of balance with your freight rates, you got to act quick and, really have good customer relationships to go back to them and say, hey, my fuel cost has increased 25%. Let's find the right rate. Makes sense for both of us. But a lot of shippers will, be a bit bullnose and try to kick that can down the road for a month. And then the trucking company's losing money and having to, really pinch every penny to stay profitable.
Well, how does this all affect overhaul and cargo theft?
So from a theft standpoint, I think it creates more opportunity for criminals. One, criminals are going to be more apt to put a low price out there to move a load with a knowing that they're going to steal it. They don't care what the freight rate is. They just want to get their hands on the load. So there will be opportunities for them to kind of go lowball, rates, for that potential. And the unknowing, dispatcher or broker that's trying to move freight may not be aware that that's happening. Or, and criminals are very sophisticated, where they will operate legitimately for weeks or months or longer until they get a load they want to steal. Then they'll start stealing, and they'll change MC numbers after they kind of get caught. But in the meantime, there's no charges pressed. There's no arrests. It's just they're kind of operating with impunity, if you want to go that far.
Well, something that's interesting to me, and we talk about this, and with a bit of a capacity tightening that's going on, and I don't know that I've heard this before, and I hope I'm not creating something by saying this, but have we ever seen criminals operate within the environment of an employee? So hence a driver trying to get hired on with a motor carrier, and then waiting my time till I get that load. And then all of a sudden, whoop, it disappeared. I don't know what happened to it.
That is the growing trend in 2026. We're seeing criminal organizations getting their team members, hired on as trucking companies, hired on as drivers, and they'll run freight for a period of time until they get a load worth stealing. And a lot of times the drivers are being forced to steal.
Right.
There's elements of human trafficking involved in this situation, where individuals are brought into the country, promised work, promised big paychecks, to their family back at their home country, and when they get over here, they're forced to steal.
No,
With
I
threats
haven't heard.
threats of violence back to their family.
I haven't heard that before. That
Yeah.
That is a reality in today's world. It's not just the same. Human trafficking is a big issue in our industry, and it's not well publicized, but we know for a fact it's there. There's criminal groups that have been around for a long time that have entered the cargo theft world. Most of them are multinational or transnational criminal organizations that also run drugs, also do other illicit activity, and the profit levels, or in cargo theft, are so high, they are being attracted to the theft industry.
Right.
I tell you, new competition even among thieves. It sounds like.
Exactly.
And
wow. So all the more reason to be more diligent in your hiring of your staff.
Yep. And now they're even, we're well connected in some of the, federal agencies, and one of their fears, if you want to put it that way, is historically organized criminal organizations did not collaborate. As a general rule, they kind of did their own operation, had their own, organization, but we're seeing more and more collaboration across, criminal organizations, which is
really okay. Wow.
They're outsourcing, they're synergizing. What are their core competencies, and what can they add? How can they add value to other criminal organizations, and they cooperate? And that is the trend.
So, kind of honor among thieves, I guess, where these are collaborating, working together to mutual benefit.
Correct. And that's a relatively new phenomenon in the last several years.
Unbelievable. Now, just out of curiosity, where do these thieves dispose of these loads?
Go online. Danny may have talked about this, but I've been in this industry for 20 plus years, the freight security industry. And when I first started here, we'd interview criminals or have a good enough relationship with, detectives that they would share a bit of, non-confidential information with us. And, 10 years ago, or maybe more, criminals would get 30 cents on the dollar for stolen product. They would steal it and have a fence that would move it. And today they have a direct-to-consumer outlet, online sales, and they can get 80 cents, 90 cents on the dollar. They can get retail valuation, and sometimes over retail valuation if it's a high-demand product. Think new releases of tennis shoes or things like that, where they can get 130, 140, even higher of retail valuation. That is what has changed. Now, still, some of the stolen product still gets moved overseas. Now, a lot of, think Latin America, think parts of Asia, they are sophisticated enough to get out of the country very, very quickly if that's where their market is. But they also have sales organizations where they have, warehouses, and they look legit from the outside. They look like legit warehouses, and loads come in, loads go out. They have teams of people selling things online. Where there's a ton of marketplaces out there. Even the Amazons and the Walmarts of the world who use, you can set up your own shop and sell through their website. They're struggling to keep criminal organizations out of their business.
Wow.
So a sophisticated cargo criminal, you can get a load, disguise its paperwork or alter its paperwork, deliver it to a, online retail warehouse, and they sell and distribute it for you and just send you a check.
It's just getting easier.
Yeah. Well, it's getting scarier and scarier. So what's a shipper or a trucking company to do about the whole problem?
There's one, it's education. Two, it's knowing who you're doing business with. There's a term out of European banking. It's called NYC, know your customer. Where if you apply for a business bank account, in different country, they do a lot of due diligence on who you are, who your customers are, how you're doing business, and have you done that vetting of who you're actually doing business with and exchanging invoices and checks with. It's starting to become more common in the U.S., but it's kind of started in Europe many years ago. Just KYC is called, not NYC, KYC.
Wow.
And so that's the biggest thing that you think trucking companies and shippers can be doing?
It's a layered solution. There's no one silver bullet. There's there's due diligence, there's background checks, there's the technology that can help you vet carriers and vet drivers, and it's a complete list of vetting and layers of security that is going to get secured. The industry needs to adopt more readily and more thoroughly. The trucking industry went through a big safety push starting 10, 15 years ago. And you guys are very well aware of that. The safety departments were invested in because it was a necessity to, mitigate against risk and, lawsuits and, things like that. The trucking industry and the logistics industry in general needs to adopt more of a security culture. Safety culture was adopted in the trucking industry on a wide scale, required by insurance companies, required, by customers to, validate that they have proper safety protocol in place. The next wave is more of a security culture that has to be more readily adopted in the industry.
Well, how can Overhaul assist the company in keeping their freight safe?
Well, that's our business. We track and monitor freight. We recover a lot of stolen freight. One of the key things that really helps keep our customers safe is really two-factor authentication of carriers. One, vetting at the time of assignment or dispatch, but additional vetting at the time of pickup. Specifically, is the driver assigned the driver picking up? Is the carrier assigned the carrier picking up? That mitigates double brokering if you can do that effectively. And if you also have to have the protocol in place to, if a driver shows up that isn't assigned to that load, they'll have the right pickup number, they'll know all the details. But if it's not the right individual and not the right trucking company, there needs to be checks in place to stop that truck from moving until further checks can be done. I always recommend, any carrier that's caught double brokering, you need to give them a warning saying, 2 strikes and you're out. But double brokering is rampant. It's rampant in the industry. In our data, 27% somewhere around 20% of loads moved in the U.S. are double brokered at some point.
Wow. Okay.
And every time
In an unknowing fashion, I imagine.
What's that? One more time.
Go ahead, Chris.
well, I was just see, now I lost my train of thought. Go ahead, Johnny.
I was going to say double brokering in an unknowing fashion, because I know there are some people that will double broker knowingly on the basis of, you know what, Mr. Client, I can't get this done. However, I got a guy that can do it, and we'll monitor it through double brokering, but with permissions, I guess, with safeguards possibly. But yeah, so at 20% is a high number.
Well, there's companies set up where double brokering is their business model. That's how they make money. That without double brokering, they wouldn't be in business. They own a brokerage company. They may own 5 or 10 trucks, but they're bringing on loads that there's no way near they could cover them all. They maybe dispatching 5 trucks a day of their own asset, but they're double brokering 40 loads a day. But they're passing themselves off on load boards as an asset-based carrier,
right?
And they get the load assigned to them, but on the back end, they're brokering it out to somebody else to move it and taking a piece.
And that every time you double broker, that's an opportunity for the thieves, I take it.
Yeah, and from a shipper's perspective, you've vetted the initial carrier. They seem legit. You've been doing business with them for a while. But you have no idea who actually is moving your freight.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And then typically that carrier who actually moving the freight has not been vetted. And we were chasing 2 loads over the weekend that were stolen through that exact same MO. And it was a large global company who brokered this load out, but the carrier they brokered it out to is just double brokered to somebody else, and it was stolen. We got it back, luckily. It took us a bit to get it back.
Right.
Get law enforcement involved and get warrants and things like that, but we got it back.
And what else, Ron, do we need to know about you and Overhaul before we wrap this up?
The logistics industry in general is going through a learning curve on how technology has impacted the broader supply chain industry. A lot of the problems we're seeing, it can be rooted into adaptation of technology that wasn't thoroughly thought through from a risk and a fraud standpoint. From a criminologist standpoint, when there is new technology brought to society, there's always an element of where criminals are thinking, how can I use this technology to make money? The little adapt that's been a fact for forever. When new technology comes to the market or comes to society, criminals always are thinking, how do we do this? How we use this? The invention of Adobe Editor, that's only been around for a few years.
Yep.
You can very effectively and with very little training go and edit a document and make it look 100% legit. And that has impacted. Criminals saw that and I can change a BOL in 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. From 5 pallets to whatever, 10 pallets to 5 pallets, or 20 pallets to 15 pallets, and the criminals know that specifically if delivering to some of these big box warehouses, they don't have the systems in place to validate that BOL real time. Mm-hmm. So criminals have taken advantage of that. When you adapt new technology, you got to think through the pros and cons, and how could somebody use this to commit fraud? And that has to be a consistent mindset. And because if you don't do that, you will probably get burned at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think almost every trucking company does get burned at one point or another. Ron Greene from Overhaul, thanks so much for coming on the Trucking Risk and Insurance podcast. And I want to thank thank Ron Greene for coming onto the show today and emphasizing the critical importance of taking action now. You've got to be resilient. If you're getting something out of this, please leave us a comment. Click a like and subscribe. And John and I will see you again next week. All the best.
Mm.